you. My name is Wheatley. I'm one of you, actually, Chanticleer. And I appreciate the opportunity to come here this morning and talk a little bit about my latest book, which is called The Trial of Phillis Wheatley. And I'd like to begin by talking a little bit about the setting, about the Boston of 1772, when this book is where it's set. If you imagine, you have to kind of go back in time in your mind and think of Boston as like a pear surrounded by water, hanging by a stem that joined the mainland, and then went around to basically North Shore, South Shore, and the rest of the contiguous, what is contiguous now. And at that time this small little pear-shaped island had like 15,000 people on it. And they were very closely nestled together because there were three big hills right on that little island-like thing. Although it is officially a peninsula, it looked like an island. It seemed like an island for every other purpose. And so with those big hills in the middle, there wasn't a lot of place to do a lot of construction of homes and things. So a lot of people, many of the people congregated around the flat land, which is coastland. And so that gives you an idea of the topography. All these people squeezed into this small little place. And as far as the history goes, in 1772, this was on the eve of the Revolution, as you all know. There were factions, as there are today, there were factions that had been politicized that were basically, you've heard it, I'm sure, before, but I've done research on it, and I think it's true. There were three major groups, because going back just, say, to the beginning of, go back 13 years, 1760 was the end of the French and Indian War. We call it the French and Indian War, the Brits called it the 7 Years' War. And what that did, once that ended, it removed the threat from Canada that the people of New England and Boston were really afraid of. And so when that happened, then Britain decided, well, we saved these guys, and so we'd like to get some money from them, and we're still administering this colony, and we'd like to, have them pay some of the fair share, because gee whiz, we're taxing our own citizens in England at a very high rate. And so let's have these. So that kind of started another separate kind of issue. But getting back to the 1773, again, this story is set at that time, and it's about a trial that took place, an actual trial that took place in Boston in 1772. I said 1772, in the fall of 1772. And what the trial was about is this young lady, this absolutely true story, this young lady was brought to Boston on a slave ship, a brig, and this was in 1760. She arrived at what used to be called Beach Street Wharf in 1760 on this brig, which if you've been down to the old Tea Party, seen those Tea Party ships, it's very much like that. Just a sidebar, in the old days, you hear about these slave ships that were filled with 400 people, and many of them, half of them maybe made it back. But she was lucky because she was put on what they called a loose pack. This ship, the Phillis, had just been built in right there where where they built the ships, and this was its maiden voyage. It was owned by a guy named Mr. Fitch, who was the biggest slave owner in Boston at that time. And he had a captain whose name was Captain Gwynn. That was the captain of this ship, who was a real kind of humanitarian guy, the way I can understand it. Because he was under strict orders, Captain Gwynn, to not bring back any children. Bring back 60 to 70 slaves, but don't bring back any children. And so what the Phillis did on our maiden voyage is they sailed from Boston over to what they called the Windward Coast in those days. That was the Gold Coast, that was West Africa. And it is reputed that Phillis was picked up somewhere in Gambia, Senegal, but I don't think that that's ever been exactly pinpointed. And so I kind of think it could be anywhere from all the way up to the Congo, because I've studied at the route of the ship. But anyway, she got picked up somewhere along there. They had these factories. They called them factories. They would bring people from the inland, captured slaves, usually in tribal wars. They'd bring them down to these factories, and they'd leave them there, and then the ship would come along, and they would, load up to the cargo, and then they would bring it back to Boston. Sometimes they'd go to on the sugar trade and go to the Caribbean. But I think this one, the Phillis came right back to Boston. So when Phillis arrived, it was July, and she was at Beach Street Wharf. If you go to Boston today, Beach Street Wharf is just Beach Street. The rest is all fill in. The wharf is gone. So that gives you an idea of the landfill that has occurred. And when I was talking about the fair and the hills, over time, of course, all those things would change. The hills were cut down and the landfill was put in, so Boston's changed so much as we know now, the modern day Boston. So Mrs. Wheatley, the Wheatleys were John and Susanna Wheatley. They were about 50 years old. Mr. Wheatley, John Wheatley, was a very prominent tailor and also a merchant. He owned a couple merchant vessels. At that particular time, they also had they had twins. Teenage twins. In 1760, they had two children in their house that were teenagers. John's the father, Susanna's the mother. The children were Nathaniel and Mary. And they were, at that time, probably about 16, although Nathaniel was attending Harvard. And in those days, Mary they didn't have public education for women. She was being tutored at home. In other words, they were a very well-educated family. So Mrs. Wheatley was like 55, as I said, and her husband said, look, you got to go down, you got to get a slave. The slave ship just came in, notices are out, you got to go down and get a slave. So she went down to, she was a devout Christian. You got to remember, they were both Congregationalists and kind of pillars of the church, of the Old South Church, and you know where that is. And so Susanna went down, I think somewhat probably reluctantly, to get a slave, because they had one other slave, but apparently that person could no longer help. In Boston, the slaves that were taken were just basically household slaves. They never became like, or rarely was it like someone who would work in the fields. Not like you picture from what happened in Virginia. So she went down to this ship, and I've studied it. There's two stories. One, she went to the slave store, which was run by a guy named John Avery, which was down at Beach Street Wharf. And the other story is that she actually went on to the Phillis. I like the one where she goes on to the Phillis, because when she went on the ship, or when she discovered this lineup of slaves, wherever the location was, it was, in fact, a situation where the adult slaves, to be sold, Africans, were lined up, and they were hiding the child. And so as Mrs. Wheatley was looking at examining this parcel, quote unquote, she saw this child, and she thought, oh, her Christian compassion took over, and she just grabbed the child. And I don't know if she had to pay anything or anything, because everybody knew everybody, and everybody was kind of wired. And so she just took the child and went back. She had a driver and a carriage, put the kid in the carriage, and they went home to their mansion in Boston, which was less than a quarter of a mile away. It was located in the shadow of the old State House. You probably all know this area. It's Kilby Street now. It would have been right on the corner of Kilby Street and State Street, which in that day was King Street. So they took her home, and they started noticing after a while that she started taking a piece of charcoal and writing things on the wall and trying to imitate her speech. And Mrs. Wheatley, what I call her America's first stage mother, Susanna, she was very impressed by this, and her goal really became to make this young child a Christian and to give her an education, and receive her eventually into the Old South Church. So within a year and a half, Phillis was reading fairly difficult passages. Now, Phillis was 7 years old. The reason they know that, can pretty much assure, she had some missing teeth, baby teeth, and they can kind of judge it's about 7 years. So they brought her home, and within a year and a half, she was being tutored, and within a year and a half, she could read even difficult passages from the Bible. And so that really stunned everyone. And before long, Phillis was actually speaking English very well and writing. She started to write her first sentences. We have an English teacher who knows about writing sentences, and they were grammatically correct. At that time, the poet laureate of England and of the United States, of the colonial America, was Alexander Pope. Anyway, Alexander Pope. And so she started imitating Phillis as she grew. She's probably around 12. She started writing these sonnets or poems that were very evocative of Alexander Pope. And so Mrs. Wheatley really picked up on that, kept encouraging her, and what she did is she started taking Phillis around to her very prominent friends in Boston and having Phillis recite poetry, her own poetry, and also recite poetry that she'd memorized. And so finally, and this went on till Phillis, her first published poem was like when she was 13 years old. It was published in the old Boston Gazette, I believe. So when she went, this went on, and by the time Phillis was 18, she had composed a slim manuscript of a number of poems, but enough to have in a book. And so Mrs. Wheatley, being the stage mother that she was, took Phillis to every publisher in Boston. And at that time there were about 6 of them. And every one of them, to a man, said, "Oh, this is wonderful poetry. Wonderful. We love it." But no one's going to believe that this young girl, 10 years out of barbarism, actually wrote it. No one's going to believe that. I mean, you've got teenage kids there. You know, let's say one of you guys didn't write it. It's some kind of a scam. So Mr. Wheatley, being the shrewd kind of political, economic, commercial leader in town, he went to the publishers and he said, "Look, let's do this. If you're willing to do it, if I can get together in one gathering the most eminent men in Boston, say 18 of them, and we can bring young Phillis in to stand before them and to prove, let them question her, just like a trial, like a jury trial. And that if she can convince them that she is the sole and true author of this poetry, and they are then willing to sign an attestation, all 17 of them, including John Hancock, by the way, including Thomas Hutchinson, the governor, including the lieutenant governor,